Unfamiliar, unfriendly terrain, deathly traps, and a deceptive enemy were some of the obstacles that confronted American soldiers during the Vietnam War. To keep soldiers alive, and to track the elusive PVA and Viet Cong soldiers, the U.S. Army had to rely on unconventional war allies. Man's best friend: dogs. The United States and South Vietnamese forces faced a number of challenges when fighting the Viet Cong and the People's Army Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The pro-communist forces used a mix of conventional strategy and guerrilla warfare to launch attacks and defend positions, while relying on a number of strategies to avoid prolonged exposed combat. The Viet Cong maximized their home advantage by increasingly adapting and leveraging the opportunities offered by the jungle environment. They dictated the duration and location of encounters, hiding in between fights by means of camouflage and tunneling. The PAV and Viet Cong stressed a philosophy of adjusting to changing conditions and technology, while learning and distributing knowledge about the enemy's location, strategies, and advantages. This model of thought and action was not only expected and required of military leaders, but of individual foot soldiers and units. Problem-solving, quick resource exploitation, and impromptu strategizing were all crucial to the Viet Cong. After combat, reports with detailed accounts of field actions, successes, and challenges were written and distributed. To avoid repeated conflict in an area, the Vietnamese armies opposing the U.S. adopted a nomadic mobility strategy, rarely remaining in a single area for more than 2 or 3 days. To accomplish this, the Viet Cong would build improvised fortified camps kept at a moderate distance from civilian villages so that they could gather intelligence, demand taxes and labor, and still keep the civilians relatively uninformed about their whereabouts and the conditions of their position. Furthermore, mobility of civilians was restricted, along with their knowledge of procedures. Even foot soldiers were left in the dark about movement until a few hours before moving, in order to prevent leaks of information in case of capture or defection, both of which were rare to begin with. Orders for movement were followed by a thorough sweep of the area that packed up everything and hid any traces of human presence. Units usually traveled to meet local guerrillas or operatives to exchange maps, intelligence, and guidance before traveling on. As for traps, trenches, and other fortifications, they were usually either left working or camouflaged so they could be reused in the same or a nearby area. Contact between units was mostly kept through field telephones and by use of messenger runners for the beginning of the war. Later on, and when units were on the move, signaling was done through gunshot patterns. Adding to the challenges Americans faced, the Vietnamese began imitating U.S. speech patterns and signals over radio and phone in attempts at deceiving U.S. soldiers into directing their fire at each other or leading them into ambushes. That particular tactic had mixed success, failing most of the time. One particular challenge that was difficult for American units to overcome, and that accounted for over 10% of fatalities by 1970, was the placement of concealed mines and booby traps. Aside from keeping soldiers exhausted from being constantly alert, the explosions slowed down American advancements and operations, damaged military equipment, and occupied American units while Viet Cong soldiers planned their next move. These traps were difficult for Americans to locate due to markings that Viet Cong-friendly forces would notice that could easily be lost in the lush environment. Even medical care was masked by concealment efforts. While access to medicine and supplies was difficult for the Viet Cong, they installed organized underground basic facilities to provide care for fighters, with caves and bunkers hosting most of the medical equipment they had access to. Reaching these spots often required going through the intricate network of tunnels, which could change every few weeks or months, thanks to explosives, dead ends, and other mechanisms that ensured that no entering enemy would be able to decipher how to get around. The Viet Cong relied on a combination of techniques to ensure they would not be followed, discovered, or rounded up immediately after fighting or while they moved. These tactics included dispersing immediately if discovered, splitting into small groups when leaving an area, creating diversionary attacks or dropping unimportant cargo so the enemy would stop to inspect it, delay rearguard units left behind after an ambush or combat so that they could attack the U.S. soldiers as they chased down the original group of Viet Cong soldiers, and most importantly, hiding in the jungle, in the fortifications, or the tunnel network. In the 1960s, the U.S. Army decided that the best way to pursue the opposing armies was to introduce canine combat tracker teams. These units had to be kept secret, both to hold them as an advantage over the enemy and to keep the involvement of the British and Brunei a secret, which might have otherwise escalated the conflict. At first, the army attempted using bloodhounds, a common hunting dog, to track the steps of the Viet Cong. However, the loud barking and howling of the bloodhounds gave too much of a signal to the pursued and proved to be significant enough of a problem to kill that experiment. The following solution was to call in British assistance, since the UK had successfully used Labrador retrievers to track down Chinese guerrilla fighters in Malaysia, as well as Indonesian guerrilla fighters in Brunei. The Labrador is a quieter dog breed that is frequently trained not only for sporting and hunting, but for disability assistance, emotional support, and law enforcement activities such as substance detection. However, involving the British in the Vietnam War would put the country in a compromising position, as it had signed on to the 1954 Geneva Accords after the First Indochina War that divided Vietnam into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the State of Vietnam in the south. While the agreement did not make the arrangement permanent, both China and the UK had agreed to withdraw their forces, and British involvement, even in a training capacity, might have been seen as a violation of the ceasefire by the Chinese. Furthermore, the training site for the combat tracker teams was the British Jungle Warfare School in Brunei, a southeastern country that had taken a neutral position with regard to the conflict. Yet the US Army desperately needed to use well-trained dogs and well-trained handlers that could collaborate with soldiers trained in visual tracking. As military historian and Special Forces soldier Gordon Rotman has stated, quote, "Granted, dogs can follow a person anywhere, but the visual tracker can determine numbers, if they're more heavily loaded, whether they're moving fast or slow, detect dropped, discarded items, etc." The Department of the Army Field Manual on Counter-Guerrilla Operations states that visual tracker teams can observe and interpret traces left by a group on the terrain or vegetation as they travel through it that can reveal details such as the sex of a person, the type of weapons they carry, the size of a group, how fast and in what direction they travel, and whether they're in good medical condition to travel. Access to these skills became a priority for the Army. Classified talks between Americans and the British resulted in a top-secret collaboration within the two countries that yielded the combat tracker teams early in the war. These were made up of 5 soldiers and 2 dogs, with a visual tracker and the Labradors with their handler in the front, a coverman, a radio operator, and the team leader. The U.S. Army kept additional dogs in standby in case one of the retrievers suffered from wounds, an illness, or an accident. This initial program saw incoming troops from America, Australia, Brunei, Malaysia, New Zealand, and the UK. Aside from the British Army Jungle Warfare Training School, trained troops also came from New Zealand's Special Air Service in Malaysia, where some of the most elite visual trackers were trained. The Labradors played a crucial role in these missions, with their noses having 300 million scent receptors, compared to the meager 5 million scent receptors humans have. More so, as Richard Cunningham, a dog handler in the Vietnam War, wrote for the New York Times, quote, "Dogs can detect movement much faster and more accurately than we can, and their ears can hear, even at a very early age, sound from 4 times farther away than we can. What's more, all our dogs had lived with our American smells for years. The scent of the Vietnamese was very different, and much easier for them to pick up and alert on." These tracking missions did not join regular expeditions, but rather chased the opposing Vietnamese forces into the depths of the jungle immediately after an encounter. The plans and procedures in place were not without their faults, however. For starters, if the teams caught up with Viet Cong soldiers, there was little they could do unless they were being followed by extensive backup, which was usually not the case due to the secrecy of the operation. The teams were usually only armed with rifles, and as previously mentioned, did not include many soldiers. Especially concerning were the times when the tracking teams were met with rainfall or nighttime, as lowered visibility complicated discerning not only the enemy's trail, but the crucial details they needed to properly prepare for engagement. Nevertheless, tracking teams were sent out near combat zones, added to infantry divisions and brigades. 2 years into the program, the United States Army launched its own tracker, handler, and dog training program at Fort Gordon in Georgia. As it integrated these newly trained soldiers into the war effort and the previous units, the Army erased the history of British, Malay, and Brunei participation. Any reference to foreign trainers or participants was blacked out or classified in the Army's archives, while team members emerging from the British Army Jungle Warfare Training School were credited to Fort Gordon instead. About dog training for these new efforts, Richard Cunningham, who handled a German Shepherd called Smokey, wrote for the New York Times, quote, "The dogs started out at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas with a thorough physical exam. Then they were observed and tested to determine which area of training they would be assigned. Aggressive dogs usually went to the Sentry Unit. Less aggressive but still highly intelligent Shepherd dogs went to the Scout School. The Labradors, with their amazing noses, went straight to tracker training. Every dog accepted was highly intelligent, and each became a canine soldier, with his or her own individual 4-digit service number tattooed in their left ear." While some of the dogs were pure breeds, a number of them were mixed breed, obtained from litters offered up by American families. Other dogs were kept from the British trained teams. The handlers were partnered up with a dog for training, which was divided into 3 parts: obedience, aggression, and scouting. Often the dogs were ready for the field before the soldiers were, being able to recognize verbal and hand commands. Impressively, the dogs were trained to recognize the start of a mission by what was known as a changeover, when the dog handler changed the animal's choke chain collar for one made of leather, in turn letting the dog know that it had a job to perform. The dogs were capable of assisting with a number of scenarios. For search and destroy operations, the dogs would signal to units where an ambush would be before they walked into it, which resulted in calls for air support or additional troops. Dogs would also detect mines and booby traps, so they could be disarmed or avoided, usually by detecting the thin, almost invisible strings tied to grenades that would set them off once someone tripped or stepped on them. Even with dogs on their side, however, the units still had trouble locating their enemies, with each platoon only catching up with a few enemy soldiers or suspected enemy soldiers. Teams would go on for months without encountering a single military group, despite finding abandoned holdouts, tunnels, and traps. The canine units did provide an element of safety for American soldiers that saved multiple lives. As Cunningham notes in his New York Times piece, quote, "Not every unit on patrol got a dog. There weren't enough to go around, and in those cases a soldier would have to walk point alone. But with a scout dog team leading the way, most patrols were successful or uneventful." Approximately 4,000 dogs served in the Second Indochina War. At the end of the conflict, the combat tracker teams were disbanded. Over 300 dogs gave their lives in the service of the war, with an unknown amount of them being injured. Despite loyal service and reported strong bonds between dogs and handlers, the Army categorized the animals as equipment, which meant that taking them back home was not a priority. As a result, only 200 of the 4,000 dogs serving in the war returned to the United States. The rest were left behind.